In the late 1960s, there was a movie starring Anthony Quinn called The Shoes of the Fisherman, in which about a bishop who was selected to be the Holy Father in Rome. It kind of caused a bit of a stir because this movie came out in the middle of the Cold War, in fact, in the height of the Cold War. And the film portrays a man from the Soviet Union being elected a Holy Father. Little did they know that just a few years later, a man from the east side of the Iron Curtain, a man from a communist country, would be elected the Holy Father. And the world has not been the same since. I remember when I took a cruise on the Queen Mary 2 just a couple of years ago. One of the last mornings I was there, I went into the restaurant and they sent me to a table. And seated at the table was an English couple whose accent I really enjoyed, but we got to talking about, usually about England, of course, how I admired Winston Churchill. She asked me if I admired also Margaret Thatcher. And of course I said, of course I admired Margaret Thatcher. She was a very good friend of our President Ronald Reagan. She said, oh yes, they were such a wonderful team. In fact, the triumvirate of cold warriors at that time was our Margaret Thatcher, your Ronald Reagan, and the Catholic Pope John Paul II. And I told her, well, I'm happy to hear her say that, because not only am I Catholic, but I am a priest. Of course, it took the world by storm, the idea that a bishop from a communist country was elected a Holy Father in the midst of the Cold War. And historians will probably be debating and discussing it for decades to come. But it is safe to say that he had no small part in the fall of the Soviet Empire and the end of the Cold War. Newt Gingrich and his wife produced a documentary on just a few days he had in his home country of Poland, and the great impact his visit had, even though the communist leaders in Poland were strongly restricting where he would go, what he would do, but they couldn't restrict what he would say. And his presence and his zeal throughout the world was no small part influential in bringing about the end of the Cold War. But who would have thought this from a man who came from a nation that has experienced such turmoil? The Nazi occupation, himself being injured during that occupation, entering the seminary secretly because the Nazi occupation had forbidden the admission of any new seminarians. Him eventually being ordained a priest, going to be educated in Rome, where he saw people live in a different freedom, a different society from his own Poland. Growing up and being appointed a bishop, traveling the world as a cardinal and archbishop of Krakow, even to the point of becoming very good friends with preachers throughout the world. The Reverend Billy Graham, who many say is the pastor to the United States, very famous and very beloved Christian preacher, tells the story that he was called and invited to Poland to preach to the people of Poland. And he was invited by the Archbishop of Krakow, Karol Wojtyła. The two had become friends during the Archbishop's travels throughout the world. But Billy Graham also tells the story that when he arrived for his mission, his preaching to the people of Krakow, unfortunately his host could not be there to receive him because the newly elected Pope had just died in Rome, and Cardinal Wojtyła had to return to Rome so soon to elect the successor to Pope John Paul I. Even Billy Graham was in Krakow, or recently in Krakow, at the time John Paul II was elected. And we all have our memories of instances on television that we saw. Perhaps some of you have seen him in person. I never did. I had to, of course, see him from the television set, which, by the way, folks, is the best seat in the house, regardless of where he is in the world. I had the distinction of being a John Paul II priest, being ordained during his tenure as the Holy Father, but also seeing the process of the world from his election in 1978, the year of 3 popes, up to his death in 2005, how the world has changed, how the church has changed, and the challenges that have faced the church all throughout that time. Alas, his papacy ended under the cloud of the great scandals that rocked the church in this country and throughout the world. His papacy saw church attendance in the Catholic Church decline like it never has in the history of at least this country. We've seen the rise of the values of the 60s take control and get a stranglehold in this country, and the values of this country descending into the depths, as we have seen in such public policies over the last couple of years. All this gained their foothold in this country, at least, if not in Europe as well, during those years of John Paul II's papacy. And so it had its challenges. He put on a good show. He was a great actor, a dynamic preacher, and a very strong presence whose influence on the progress of the world will go down in history. But we also saw during his papacy the shallowness of the Catholic faithful. The shallowness of the Catholic faithful, which he as a shepherd had to face and lead and challenge. And while they say at the beginning of his papacy, if there was any question as to what the church teaches, there was no question as to what the church teaches at the end of his papacy. He was very clear. He was very strong. And it drove a lot of people away from the church because they didn't have that depth of faith that he challenged all of us to have in his dynamism, in his charisma. And perhaps it was the perfect successor, albeit for a brief amount of time, that John Paul II, who taught us what the church teaches, was followed by the very Pope who beatified him, Benedict XVI, who's very strong in terms of why the church teaches what it teaches. And now we have the Holy Father who will canonize him next year, Francis, who now is showing us how to apply that deep faith we are all called to profess. I always like to see these three Holy Fathers, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and now Francis, as the perfect triumvirate, not of cold warriors, but the perfect triumvirate of post-Vatican II popes. In many ways, Benedict, as brief as he was, is that centerpiece of the hourglass. John Paul II is up at the top, Benedict is the middle through which all the sand sifts through, and Francis is that bottom portion, in which all that teaching and its reasons and its background land into the lap of how we practice it, how we put that faith into practice in our lives. And these are the three popes who came upon the heels of John the 23rd, who will also be canonized with John Paul II, and Pope Paul VI, the two popes of the Second Vatican Council. The only one between them was John Paul I, who was pope for just a brief month. But it begins with the papacy of Pope John Paul II, the showman and the shepherd, the cold warrior and the faithful follower of Christ, the man from communist Poland who was among the world leaders who helped bring the world out of the threat that communism brings to freedom, and a man who still applied that into the faith that we all profess. So that it was the faith that took part in those movements of freedom. It was the faith that was the springboard to bring freedom to all those countries in the communist bloc. And it will be the faith that continues to help them move forward even during these difficult times of regime change, government change, and so on and so forth. So we continue to see the effects of John Paul's leadership, but we also see the effects in terms of our own faith and our own church. And we are called, with our current Holy Father, who will canonize Blessed John Paul II, to be Pope Saint John Paul II, to apply the very teachings that John Paul gave us for those many years of his papacy, the depth that Pope Benedict gave us during his brief papacy, so that all of us, in following the example of John Paul II and the leadership of our Holy Fathers, grow to have that depth of faith. I always say, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, Francis, any Holy Father, no matter how much we love them, no matter how dynamic they are only as good as the flock that follows them. John Paul saw a decline of the flock during his papacy. but we still hear his teachings and listen to his words. And if we don't respond to them in our lives as followers of Christ, then we will be canonizing the worst pope we've ever had. But we must respond to his teaching, imitate his dynamic presentation of that faith, emulate his confidence, his joy, and his love, but also the strength of his teaching. And as we canonize him, and as on this day we celebrate the last time we will ever celebrate the feast of Blessed John Paul II, we emulate that in his life, his example, in our lives of faith. Then he will be, in fact, eventually, later on down the line, John Paul the Great. Not because he put on a good show, not because he helped topple communism, but because the flock responded to him in such a way as to add greater depth to the faith we profess and the presence and impact of the Catholic Church in our world